class. But one of the reasons that Mormonism is so interesting is because, I mean, it's interesting in and of itself, but it's really the ultimate expression of a kind of American understanding of what religion is. So much of what happens within Mormon theology takes place in Latin America, and it takes place in North America, as we did talk about. This final great battle happens in upstate New York, so it doesn't really get more American than that. So try and read the parts of the Book of Mormon that I sent you, and just be prepared for a good discussion on that. And if you didn't get that, let me know. I can resend that. But I would have sent that, I think, in the very first email that went out to everybody. Next week should be normal. I should have normal office hours. Nothing should be weird. Everything. But if things change, I'll let you know. But hopefully everything will be fine. I do hope that you're still working on your papers. I've had a number of you come by the office and talk about different ideas, and they're all very good. I would like to emphasize that my desire for you to write on a biographical figure was really a means of trying to get you into a topic as quickly as possible. So I was trying to give you something really tangible that you could latch onto. If for whatever reason you feel like the paper you want to write on just does not in any way lend itself to actually writing something biographical, that's fine. Just let me know, and we can work something out. But really, this was meant, and I say that because the reason I did the biography was to make it easy. But if it's not making it easy, then it's defeating its own purpose. So let me know if there's something else that you'd rather do, and I'm sure we can work something out. So the other thing about today is we're going to watch our first movie clip, but we're not going to do it quite yet. I want to lecture for about 35 minutes. And then we're going to watch 2 scenes from Black Robe, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, what that is. I will warn you, it is pretty brutal. So, but I tried to edit some of the more brutal stuff, so I tried to make it somewhat PG, even though it's definitely an R movie overall, from the violence. It's you'll see, and there are reasons. Well, we can talk about this. I'm hoping. So I've got about 25 minutes of clips that I want to show you from it, and I'm hoping we'll have at least a little bit of time to talk about it at the end. If not, I think it's pretty obvious what we're looking at, but I still would like to talk about it some, especially, I know some of you have been interested as we're thinking about Native Americans, and we're thinking about what their place is in world history. So that's a good segue into what I want to talk about today. We often have this image, and this image has been portrayed, this kind of that first myth I gave you when we talked about mythology a few weeks ago, that myth of something Edenic. And there's no doubt that when we look at the early Spanish attempts to understand the American Indian, they did so in both a fashion of extreme innocence, in which they thought of the Indians as kind of a form of Adam and Eve, but then also with extreme brutality. And so we get that second myth, the Black Legend, as well. So the Spanish are never really able to figure out exactly how they should treat the Indian. Should they treat them as Adam and Eve, or should they, that is, as a pre-fallen Adam and Eve, or should they treat them as basically intelligent animals? And it won't be, as I said, until the late 1530s, a good, really almost half of a decade, half of a century later, after Columbus has discovered the Indians, that they really do finally decide that the American Indian is a human being fully capable of free will and therefore capable of salvation. So it's going to take a while to reach that, and that means that you've got a good 40 plus years in which there are debates going on about the nature of the American Indian. And we've never really lost this. For those of you who have seen the Disney movie Pocahontas, you know how much the Disney myth plays into the ideal of this kind of perfect Indian, or this almost Franciscan nature queen, this earth goddess. And that is a very typical image that we have, and especially in our children's books and the way that we teach the American Indian. And the American Indians have really kind of promoted this, as Deidre said the other day. Quite often they try to downplay a lot of their own brutality towards one another. And all I want to suggest is that the Indians are definitely human. They remake their environment. They go to war with one another. They're fallen people like everybody else. And so we have to get past many of the stereotypes as well. I don't want to fall into the stereotype that somehow they're less than human, that would be just as ridiculous as trying to claim that somehow they're superhuman. They are human. And therefore, everything that we talk about, we have to take into account that we're dealing with a very, very complex culture, usually a whole series of cultures. There's not one Indian culture, but as one person has estimated, there were probably 500 different ways of Indian living just north of the Rio. So what's in present-day Canada and what's in the United States, probably 500 distinct peoples. Now, sometimes they share environmental conditions, sometimes they share linguistics, sometimes they share various cultural norms. So, for example, the Cheyenne and the Sioux, even though they were two different tribes, often worked together. They would usually meet together once a year and try and figure out where their hunting grounds would be, negotiating, working out treaties, trying to figure these things out. But it's also just as often that tribes would go to war with one another during one year, and then the following year ignore each other, and then the year after that be friends, and then go back to war after that. So in a lot of ways, knowing what we do know about the American Indians, it's very little different than what we know about the rest of the peoples in the world. Now, what's unique about the American Indian, though, and this I think should be obvious from everything we've talked about, the American Indian in terms of his genetics is very, very limited compared to other peoples in the world. That is, the gene pool that makes up the American Indian is the smallest gene pool that we have in the world of any distinct people. The Europeans had been intermixing not only with each other, but with Africans and with Asians for years upon years upon years, in which they had interacted not only by intermarrying, especially those living on the various border regions of each of these places, but had been interacting in terms of trade and had been working with one another. So if you can imagine Europe, think about Europe in roughly 1400, Europe has just been able to get barely out of its own disease phase. There's a very famous historian, he's passed away now, but there was a very famous historian by the name of William McNeill, McNeill. And so we call this McNeill's Law. But McNeill's argument was that one of the major reasons we see a less advanced technological people usually succumbing to a more advanced technological people is often rarely due to the technology advantage. The technology advantage is definitely an advantage. There's something there with the technology that allows one people to conquer another. But it's almost always the disease factor that undermines the lesser developed people, because a lot of people are lesser developed in terms of technology simply because they have not been interacting with other peoples. And if the American Indians really did come over, as we now estimate, between, say, 30,000 and 22,000 BC, with only a couple of more migrations to add to that, that means that the American Indian overall has been isolated for close to 10 to 12,000 years from all other peoples. And so as the Europeans, throughout the 1300s, are getting smallpox and getting the plague and all of these various diseases run through the European community. And remember, for those of you who've had European history, almost 50% of the Europeans were killed by their own disease factor during the 1300s. If they had already gone through all that, it means that by the time they encounter the American Indian, they have, for the most part, weathered those diseases, but they carry them. And yet, even having said that they weathered those diseases, we know that in the 1400s in Europe, probably 1 out of every 7 persons died of smallpox still, because it would come in each new generation. And in terms of demographics, there are always a couple of dates that you have to know for what longevity is. So for a baby for there to be conception, and then for conception to lead to birth, we usually, in a pre-modern time, we give it about a 50-50 chance. So about half of the babies conceived probably ended in some kind of disaster in the womb. Something went wrong, right? Some kind of complication or something. So about 50-50. And then if you make it to birth, making it from birth to making it to age 2 is also about a 50-50 proposition. And then making it from age 2 to age 15 is a 50-50 proposition. And then making it from age 15 to age 30 is a 50-50 proposition. So this is what the disease factor was like. And a few of you have taken the cemetery tour with me. One of the things you notice over in Oak Grove Cemetery, of course, this absolutely gorgeous Protestant cemetery that we have in this town, and one of the most beautiful parts of the town. But you'll notice that you'll see parents where they'll have 6 or 7 children buried right next to them, and they all died at age 2. They all died at age 3 or 4. And that was a very typical thing up until the 20th century, that you have these birth rates that are very, very chancy. They're very dicey. So we take this for granted now. It's very rare for someone to lose a baby or to miscarry. It's extremely rare. I'm sure we all know of cases where it happens. But it's so rare compared to what it used to be. And a lot of that has to do with nutrition. It has to do with all kinds of things in terms of health. We also understand germs, like we did not understand prior to the Civil War. Prior to the 1890s, we understand how germ theory works. So there are certain things that we've gotten down in the last 100 and 150 years that really throughout history, whether European or American Indian, you just didn't have much of a chance. And yet there are major changes. So here's what happens. Columbus shows up, and it seems to be the case, now we don't know this for certain, but when Columbus shows up in 1492, it seems to be the case that none of his men are carrying anything, because we don't know of any mass outbreaks among the American Indians. But in 1493, on his second voyage, Columbus brought with him about 1,200 men. The first, with just 3 ships, was just a very quick exploratory. It was just an attempt to see what was there, what was not. Could they make it to the Indies, to Japan? Could they not? And so it was a very streamlined expedition. But when he goes back the following year in 1493, he takes with him cattle and horses and pigs and all kinds of seed, and 1,200 colonists go with him to plant a colony in, of course he doesn't know it's the New World, he still thinks he's in Asia, but to plant that in Asia. And there, disease ran rampant among the people who came with him. Now, again, probably they had no idea that they were carrying smallpox or whatever it was, diphtheria, that they may have been carrying, but they were carrying these diseases. They were, as human beings, carriers of these. And so this is really the beginning in 1493 of a mass killing of American Indians. And I want to stress this point because I think it's a really critical point to understand, and that is, without knowing it, Europeans probably killed anywhere from 20 to 95% of the American Indians. We just don't know how many were actually killed by disease, but probably the best estimate is somewhere between about 80 and 90% of all American Indians died because of disease. I mean, that is stunning, especially when you think that the Europeans at best had only a 50% death rate with the Black Plague, but if the American Indian could have had upwards of 90% death, it just shows you how utterly susceptible the American Indian was to these diseases, and in large part because they had been isolated for so long. So as Deidre gave you the statistic in Mexico, where you have very strong concentrated populations, native populations, it went from about 20 million to 1 million. And just imagine what that does to your culture. Imagine if disease hits, and this disease, when it hits a village, when it hits an Indian village, it can hit that village and change it within 2 weeks. You could have mass killing within 2 weeks. Europeans are astounded by this. They don't celebrate it. That's one of the things that we have to be very clear in American history. The Europeans, when they encounter the Indian, quite often, well, more often than not, are trying to convert the American Indian. And if you're a missionary and you show up at a village and 2 weeks later 90% of the population's dead, you don't have a lot of people to convert. That's not a positive situation, and it's very, very frustrating horrifying to the Indians, frustrating to the missionaries. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say, and I think, again, just to kind of knock the idea that we committed genocide against the Indians, we as an American people spent thousands of dollars in the 19th century trying to inoculate the American Indian. We just spent all kinds of money and sent people out west to inoculate the Indians. Most of the Indians refused to take the inoculation, not trusting the white men, but one tribe that did were the Sioux. And the Sioux are the only tribe in all of North America that actually saw a population increase during the 19th century. And in large part because they took the inoculations and they were able to resist the diseases that were sweeping through. You don't read about mass Sioux killings in terms of disease like you do with the Pawnee or the Arikara or the other American Indian tribes, all of whom will have these horrible years. They'll talk about the summer of the plague or the summer of the pox, where these things just were rampant. Doesn't happen with the Sioux. As far as we know, and I'm open to counter evidence to this, but as far as we know, there was only one person ever on the European side who tried to infect the Indians with any kind of disease, and this was a British officer during the 1760s, a guy by the name of Geoffrey Amherst. Amherst, Massachusetts, and Amherst College is named after him. Not what I would call a credit to their college, but Amherst was the only one who took smallpox-infested blankets and distributed them to the Indians to try and kill them. He didn't really quite understand what he was doing, though he knew it was vicious. Nobody would understand exactly what that meant until after the Civil War, but he had an inkling that if these people had smallpox and they had these blankets wrapped around it at the time of death, that there may be smallpox in the blanket as well. So bright enough to be able to do that, but also obviously wicked enough in what he was attempting to do. But he is the exception to the rule. The rule was that for the most part, the American Indian died by no fault of anyone except this ravaging of nature. So, what do the Europeans bring with them then? Without question, their greatest weapon is this disease factor, even though they don't mean for it to spread. But I also want you to think about other things that the Europeans bring, and I'll give you 3 examples of what the Europeans bring. Number 3 being disease. So let me go to the first and the second. What do the Europeans bring with them? The first thing they bring, which we don't often think about how important this can be, but they bring with them European agricultural products. So they bring with them wheat and various forms of things that we, the American Indians, would have called weeds. That is, they bring all kinds of agricultural products to grow. Now, just as the American Indian has been isolated for thousands upon thousands of years, so has American flora and fauna been isolated for thousands and thousands of years. It has not really had to compete. So what do we see? Even things like wheat and rye, which of course for the Europeans were once weeds and then became crops, seeds were often carried by accident through legitimate agricultural products, plants and animals, for example, carrying all kinds of things on them when Columbus brought this over, and they can suddenly be let loose. So imagine, for those of you from the American East, what's the prime kind of grass that you like to grow in your yard? Everybody wants it. If you live in the American East, in Kansas, you can't grow it. It's not enough water. Anybody want to take a guess? Do you guys still mow your yards? Shelby?
Well, I'm not from the East. It's not like Kentucky bluegrass.
It is Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is from central Spain. It's not Kentuckian at all. And it's the kind of thing that when it gets here, it just spreads wildly because it can grow naturally and it can outcompete the native grasses. Now, that's not true in places like the Great Plains. Remember when I showed you the tall grass on the Great Plains? Nothing that the Europeans bring is going to be able to replace that until they can get rid of that tall grass. And that's going to take a bit to get rid of because of how deep the root system is. And Europeans don't have a plow originally to be able to take care of that. It won't be until Germans from Russia, people who had lived on the steppes, that is the Great Plains of Russia, were able to take those agricultural techniques and apply them to the Great Plains of North America. But number 2, think about what else the Europeans bring with them. They bring with them their animals. And these animals are going to change the landscape. American Indians had once had horses, but those horses were long, long gone. They've been gone for a long time. There was no cattle, and there were no pigs. All of this was introduced by the American explorer, that is, by the European. So one historian writing about this says, fortunately for the Europeans, their domesticated and lively, adaptable animals were very effective at initiating change. The prospective European colonists were livestock people, as their ancestors had been for millennia. Think about how successful the Europeans had been with livestock, going all the way back to Jericho, if not before. The founders of these Neo-Europes, and I'll talk in a little bit about what a Neo-Europe is, these founders of the Neo-Europes were descendants culturally and often genetically of the Indo-Europeans, a West Central Eurasian people who spoke the ancestral language of most of the tongues of Europe, that is, of English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, and Russian. They were a people who had been practicing mixed farming with heavy emphasis on herding 4,500 years before Columbus even thought about setting sail. Now, again, I don't know how many of you have grown up on a farm, but anybody in here grow pigs? Raise pigs? Nobody? Anybody know anything distinctive about the pig? Something it doesn't share with other domestic livestock? It's pretty amazing. It has a cloven hoof. In other words, its hoof is a little plow. Everywhere it walks, it breaks the soil. And that means that all of these new grasses and all of these things that the Europeans are bringing in terms of plants have essentially their own fertile soil to be able to grow in. So you get all of these things that the Europeans are bringing with them, and it's radically changing the landscape of North America. The kind of flora and fauna that we have, with the exception of birds, but the kind of flora and fauna that we have has been radically altered by the Spanish expedition and the other expeditions coming here. So let me just read to you all the things that the Europeans brought with them coming here to North and South America. And it's pretty stunning when you think about all of these various factors and what one can give to the other. So, the Old World. You don't have to write all this down. It's be too much to write down, but let me just give you the list. The Old World brought horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, chicken, honeybees. It's kind of amazing. You think about what the bee can do. Coffee, which come from the Turks. Wheat, rice, barley, cabbage, turnips, lettuce, pears, peaches, lemons, oranges, bananas, olives, lilacs, carnations, daffodils, tulips, daisies, crabgrass, that's what grows in Kansas, Kentucky bluegrass, dandelions, smallpox, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, and whooping cough. That all came from the Old World and radically changed the American Indian landscape. So imagine if all of your American Indian agricultural practices are all based on a certain type of soil and a certain type of plant. All of that's now being invaded by the Europeans. And we know that the European frontier, and this is something I do want you to know, but the European frontier was always about 20 miles ahead of where the Europeans were actually settling. So it was carried by various animals, birds, dogs, other things, that would expand about 20 miles ahead, and disease especially was always just about 20 miles ahead of where the Europeans were. We don't know exactly why, but the disease frontier, we always say, is 20 miles. Now, what did the New World give to the Old? What did Columbus take back with him? And I say Columbus here more symbolically than literally, but what did he take back? Well, again, here's a large list of things, many of which probably should not be surprising to any of us, except for maybe the first two products, because tomatoes and potatoes come from the New World. So tomatoes, potatoes, corn, sweet potatoes, bell and chili peppers, pimentos, chocolate, vanilla, beans, lime pole, navy, kidney beans, squash, pumpkins, avocados, peanuts, pecans, cashews, guavas, pineapples, and sunflowers. And as Deidre mentioned the other day, only one disease, but an important one, syphilis. The interesting thing, of course, and not to get into biology 101 here too much, but the interesting thing about syphilis is it's a freely chosen disease. You can only get it by doing certain activities. That's not the same thing with smallpox or with the other things that the Europeans were bringing. It tells you what people were doing when they got syphilis, but it's still one of those diseases that could have been prevented. But just imagine, how could we ever think of modern Europe without the tomato and without the potato? How could you even describe Italian culture without the tomato? It's nearly impossible. How could you explain Irish culture without the potato? And one of the things that I think is worth stressing, and I've had students before when I've given this lecture, I'll just be careful how I say this. So, think about what a potato can do. Potatoes are the easiest thing to grow. You throw them in the ground, and you get more and more potatoes unless there's a blight, which does happen, and when it does happen, it's serious, but it doesn't happen that often. Potatoes are extremely hardy, and it means that for the very first time in European history, when the potato is imported into Northern Europe, and the potato is imported into Northern Europe by roughly 1500, by the time the potato goes to Northern Europe, it means that for the first time in history, a Northern European can have the same caloric intake as a Southern European. The first time. Now, here's where I have to be careful about how I say this. It's not completely accidental that the Reformation happens 20 years, a generation after there's been a caloric change. I don't in any way want to suggest, and I don't want to hear Dr. Kaltoff knocking on my door. Berzer, did you say Martin Luther arrived because of the potato? That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. But it was a contributing factor, because the Northern Europeans could not have had a successful Reformation unless they were, in many ways, physically the equal of the Southern Europeans at that time. And the Southern Europeans had a much greater advantage because of growing season than the Northern Europeans did up to that point. Again, I'm not saying it's a direct correlation, but it is a factor. Alex?
I was just going to ask, how could you draw a correlation between the potato and the Reformation?
Only in the
With,
sense...
caloric intake.
Because it does allow not only for a stronger... It means that the North is far less dependent upon the South for its food. Prior to that, you had all of Northern Europe was, in terms of its foodstuffs, heavily reliant upon the South for certain things. And the South, it's not, think about it this way too. It's not accidental that all the great explorers come from the Southern European countries, especially in the Age of Discovery. You're not going to see, you had the Vikings, but different era. You don't see the great explorers coming out of Northern Europe. They all come out of the Mediterranean, and they come out of a Mediterranean culture that has been able to feed itself very well for a very, very long time. Alex, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so that's it. If it's a correlation, it's a pretty indirect one, but it does matter in the reshaping of Europe.
It means that they have a stronger body constitution, right?
Better longevity and so forth, absolutely. Okay. They get a much higher lifespan once the potato is introduced into Northern Europe. Yeah, Nolan.
So, like you were saying, Southern Europe could have kind of bolstered caloric intake. What was Northern Europe kind of relying on before?
Yeah, mostly sheep that and certain kinds of grains that they could grow. But remember, if you're in a place like Sweden, you've got about a 2.5 month growing season. That's it. If you're in a place like Italy, you have an 11-month growing season. So even though Italy and Sweden are both a part of Europe, it's a radically different. You have a radically different ability to grow certain crops in the north. So they could still grow, but they could only grow within that time span. And I'm not sure. It's a good question. I'm not sure what the staple crop was before the potato hit. There was clearly, it was mutton and various things, but I'm not exactly sure what they were really living on. You're going to laugh at this. The notes that I have, and I'm not sure what I was thinking when I wrote them, the notes I have is that the Europeans, basically Northern Europeans, ate gruel. And I'm not even totally sure what gruel is, and I didn't take time to look it up before coming in, but I assume it's a kind of porridge of some kind, probably oats of some kind.
I just thought of I didn't know that the potato came to Northern Europe so much later than I thought.
Absolutely. It's really hard to imagine Europe without either the potato or the tomato, right?
Potatoes in Ireland.
Yeah.
Hand in hand.
absolutely. I mean, how can you have an Irish culture without it? Yeah, it's so important to it. So again, I think this new world discovery matters. And so the name that we give this as historians, the name we give it is the Columbian Exchange. And that is a pretty important term for trying to explain what happens in terms of bringing the world together. And as scholars have argued, probably the best scholar on this is a guy named Alfred Crosby, who had a book in the early 70s called the Columbian Exchange, and then wrote a book called Biological Expansion in the late ecological expansion in the late 1980s. But this guy Crosby argues that really what happens with Columbus, possibly the most important moment in world history outside of religious events, but probably the most important moment since the original 7 continents broke apart from each other. And so in many ways, what was Pangea, all of the continents together, this is what Columbus is recreating by going on this voyage. So what does that do for Columbus for us? What does that make him? He's a cultural and an agricultural arbiter, but you have people claiming, one of my favorite actors, a guy named Russell Means, if any of you have ever seen Last of the Mohicans, he plays Shinbat Shook in it. He's a Sioux Indian, and he made this famous statement in the late 1980s that obviously Columbus was worse than Hitler because of all the deaths that resulted. But there is a difference. Columbus, even though he made some major mistakes in what he was doing, never intentionally massacred all of these people. It's the fate of nature. It's the fate of ecological systems where this happens. Now, I want to get back to Alex's point for a moment before we stop and go to the movie, and that is this. I also, in the same way, I don't want you thinking that I'm accusing Lutherans of existing because of the potato. I don't want you thinking that I'm an environmental determinist or that we should be an environmental determinist. Just because the environment does something doesn't necessarily determine how we're going to live. In fact, the environment shapes us in radically different ways. I mean, think about how different we're going to dress today versus most likely how different we'll be dressing during finals week. I would assume that we're going to respond to the environment, that the environment's going to get colder, and that we're going to be wearing more and more clothes as the year goes on. We respond to the environment in the same way that if any one of us in this room just showed up in Houston right now, the chances are good you're not going to put on a wool coat and walk around downtown Houston. We respond to the environment, but it doesn't necessarily determine who and what we are. Now, in a case like disease, there you have a more determining factor, because obviously if your culture, or 50 to 90% of it, is wiped out within a few weeks because of diphtheria or because of smallpox, this is radically going to change what you do. But think about this as well. When these diseases hit people, and it was the same thing when the disease hit the Europeans during the 1300s, disease almost always hits the elderly, and it almost always hits the young before it hits anyone else. And the people who usually survive are almost always young males, about age 20, 21, males in their prime, have the best survival rates during these disease epidemics, during these disease factors. And that is never, I mean, just imagine if the ATOs were left on campus to rule, right? I mean, just think about that for a moment. That is not a good situation. Nothing against anyone. But you don't want to lead all of these people and have them left. And that's exactly what happened. You lose your elderly, you lose your young, and you've got very angry young men left trying to make decisions about what's going on in these cultures. And it's not a good cultural situation at all. Okay, does that all make sense for everyone? So keep that in mind. Okay, last thing I want to state, and I said this on Thursday last week, but I won't be able to get to it again until we come back and see each other next week, because you're going to have Dr. Mack on Thursday. So we'll get to this on Tuesday. But I do really want to stress, and I can't stress this enough, as I did on Thursday at the very end of class, for the Europeans and European exploration, 1492 from Spain, 1493 from Portugal, and then we'll see colonization by the English and the Dutch and the French in the early 1600s. As we start seeing all of this, there is always this complication that we know that these people are greedy for gold, but that greediness is always, at least historically if we're going to be honest, it's always offset by their desire to spread God's word. So almost everything they're doing has some religious motivation. And even Columbus, as I talked about briefly on Thursday, even Columbus, when he sailed, he made Ferdinand and Isabella promise. This was part of everything that his voyage had to do with. Whatever money they made from his voyage was meant to be used to retake Jerusalem from the Turks and to reconquer the Holy Land. He wanted a last crusade. Now, we can agree or disagree with Columbus on his motivation, but we can't deny his motivation. His motivation was very clearly from a kind of millennialist Christian viewpoint, and that's what he sees himself doing, practicing this. And the same thing was true even with someone very brutal like Cortez. Cortez still very much believed that he was doing God's will. And most people who settle in North America, and South America as well, have this. The problem is, of course, you're going to have a great division between those who have a Catholic vision and those who have a Protestant vision. And they're going to start seeing each other as rivals for which one can actually settle North America and do so as quickly as possible. But they all have this religious motivation, even when it's mixed with greed. That greed is there for a specific reason too, and that reason is to be able to bolster these things like crusades and do other things against the Muslims in particular. Okay, so any questions on any of that? Okay, so no environmental determinism, but just awareness of how important the environment is in human history. All right, and Lutherans are good people. All right, good.